They had already warned him that forcing this decision would destroy his fleet. The records show he overruled them anyway, and thousands paid the price. What failed here wasn't courage or manpower. It was judgment. A single decision, made against expert advice, turned overwhelming imperial power into a controlled disaster. The consequences were immediate, documented, and politically inconvenient, which is why later accounts tried to soften responsibility. But when the evidence is pulled apart, the pattern is clear. This was not inevitable. It was chosen. The victims were not nameless. They were the backbone of an empire's naval machine. Professional sailors drawn from subject states, experienced commanders, and entire fleets built over decades. Their vulnerability was structural. They did not control strategy. They executed orders. And when strategy collapsed, they had no exit. Xerxes inherited the largest invasion force the ancient Mediterranean had ever seen. His authority rested on divine kinship, court loyalty, and precedent, not operational expertise. Naval warfare was delegated to allied admirals from Phoenicia, Egypt, Cyprus, and Ionia. These were not ceremonial figures. Phoenician commanders, in particular, were regarded as the best sailors in the Persian sphere. With centuries of maritime dominance behind them, their routines were disciplined and cautious. They emphasized formation, maneuvering space, and supply security. They understood trireme warfare intimately, how speed, or coordination, and room to turn mattered more than raw numbers. They also understood risk. Narrow waters neutralized numerical advantage. Mixed fleets struggled with coordination, and command clarity mattered more than royal presence. Those facts were known before the decisive order was issued. The Persian navy had already suffered losses. Storms off the Magnesian coast had destroyed hundreds of ships. Logistical strain was constant. Crews were fatigued. Supply lines stretched across hostile territory. Still, the fleet remained enormous. By conservative estimates, several hundred warships after losses. The Greek coalition opposing them was smaller, fragmented, and politically unstable. Strategically, Persia did not need a decisive naval battle. Time favored Xerxes. Greek city-states were divided. The Peloponnese was preparing defensive fortifications. A patient blockade, combined with land pressure, could have fractured resistance without risking the fleet. This was the core of the admirals' advice. They argued for delay. They advised withdrawing the fleet to open water, maintaining pressure without engagement, and letting Greek cohesion collapse. They warned that fighting in confined straits would compress Persian formations, disrupt command signals, and negate their numerical edge. They were not guessing. They were describing known naval mechanics. Xerxes rejected them. The timeline shows a rapid narrowing of options. Greek commanders, led by Themistocles, actively sought to force a naval engagement. Messages were sent, some genuine, some deceptive, suggesting Greek disunity and imminent retreat. Xerxes believed speed would deliver final victory. He ordered the fleet forward, into waters his own advisors had explicitly warned against. The critical decision was not simply to fight, it was where and how. Persian ships advanced into a narrow channel. The fleet was multinational, with varying training standards, languages, and signaling systems. Formation discipline deteriorated almost immediately. Rear divisions pressed forward without visibility. Oars fouled. Commands conflicted. Greek ships, operating from shorter lines and unified command, exploited the congestion. They attacked piecemeal targets. Persian numerical superiority became irrelevant because ships could not engage. Simultaneously, damage compounded quickly. Disabled vessels blocked movement. Panic spread along the line. This is where responsibility becomes unavoidable. Xerxes had positioned himself to observe the battle. Later sources describe him recording deeds of valor and failure. That detail matters because it undercuts claims of ignorance. He saw the collapse in real time, yet there is no evidence of an order to disengage early, when withdrawal was still possible. Instead, the battle continued until losses were irrecoverable. When the fleet broke, the consequences rippled outward. Naval control was lost. Supply routes to the army became vulnerable. The land campaign, now isolated, could no longer sustain its original objectives. Xerxes withdrew a significant portion of his forces, leaving a reduced army behind under Mardonius, a tacit admission that the strategic balance had shifted. The investigation into blame began almost immediately, not formally, but politically. Persian court narratives sought scapegoats. Greek sources later accused certain Persian admirals of cowardice or treachery. Phoenician commanders were reportedly executed after the defeat, accused of underperformance, but this explanation collapses under scrutiny. These were the same commanders whose advice had been ignored. They had opposed the engagement. Their fleets had performed competently under prior operations. Executing them did not restore naval power. It removed institutional memory. No evidence suggests coordinated failure or betrayal among the admirals. What the sources actually show is fragmentation caused by imposed strategy, not disobedience. There is also the problem of selective survival in the records. Most detailed accounts come from Greek historians writing decades later. Persian administrative records from the period are sparse, but even hostile Greek sources acknowledge that Persian commanders warned against the battle. That admission is significant. It runs against Greek narrative interest and therefore carries weight. The contradiction sits at the center of the case. Expert advice was available, documented, and rejected, yet responsibility was displaced downward. Public reaction within the empire is harder to reconstruct, but the institutional consequences are visible. Persia never again attempted a large-scale naval invasion of Greece. Investment shifted back toward land operations and diplomacy. The aura of invincibility was punctured. Subject states with naval capacity, particularly in Ionia, became harder to control. In Greece, the victory reshaped political credibility. Naval power, once secondary to hoplite warfare, became central. Athens leveraged its fleet into imperial influence. The long-term balance of power in the Aegean changed, not because Persia lacked resources, but because it misapplied them. Why did Xerxes dismiss his admirals so completely? Some scholars point to court politics, a preference for decisive action over cautious delay, reinforced by advisors who framed hesitation as weakness. Others argue overconfidence after early successes distorted risk assessment. There is also the possibility that intelligence failures, particularly misreading Greek intentions, created a false sense of urgency. What is clear is that no operational necessity forced the decision. Alternatives existed. They were articulated. They were ignored. There is also the issue of accountability. Persian kingship concentrated authority at the top, but insulated it from consequences. Failures could be reframed as subordinate incompetence without challenging royal legitimacy. This structure incentivized obedience over accuracy, a pattern that appears repeatedly in imperial collapses across history. The final unease comes from how preventable the disaster was. This was not a storm, not an ambush, not a surprise attack. It was a deliberate choice made in full knowledge of the risks, against informed opposition, with irreversible consequences. The admirals did their job, the fleet did what it was ordered to do, and the system ensured that the wrong people paid for the mistake. When power overrides expertise, evidence stops mattering, and when evidence is ignored, outcomes stop being accidents.